distinct honour and privilege to once again be preaching before you on this Reformation Sunday. We have had the distinct pleasure of hearing a multitude of verses and passages throughout the service that have been pointing us to various doctrinal themes that exploded in the Reformation. We have seen sola scriptura in the beginning, we've seen sola gratia and sola fide, grace alone and faith alone. And now here we are reading particularly from a passage which takes a bit of a different bent, a bit of an unfamiliar bent, but nevertheless is actually a passage which on the conceptual and theological level speaks to the very heart of the Reformation itself and indeed the Gospel. The words up on the screen at the moment might seem unfamiliar to you given the fact that the top line is in Latin. Reading post Tenebras Lux, which as you can see underneath means after darkness, light. Now whilst we have preached many times from this pulpit the various solas of the Reformation, indeed throughout our time apart during the COVID lockdowns we had a 5-week series on the solas of the Reformation, and I'm taking it that was actually well received by most of you. Indeed, we have spoken about the Reformation and the kind of ideals and the theology that was rediscovered during that time so much from this pulpit. But this morning I want to address something which is, I think, a bit different from perhaps what we looked at before, but nevertheless, as I mentioned, central to not only what the Reformers were holding as their central ideal, but indeed what they elevated and had propagated over the last 500 years. What was read to us thankfully by Danny is in fact a particularly important passage in the Gospel of Matthew. And the broader context, which was in part covered there, but to expand upon it so that we can see exactly what we're looking at, Jesus has just completed his temptation in the wilderness. And indeed now John, by this point, has been arrested. John the Baptist has been arrested. And indeed now Jesus, as was mentioned, has fled up into Galilee, up into Naphtali and Zebulun. And this was done, as according to Matthew, as he mentions here, in fulfillment of prophecy. Now the particular prophecy that is being mentioned here comes from Isaiah chapter 9, and specifically verse 2. And it begins that section that most Christians know quite well surrounding Christmas. For unto us a child is born, and to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, and his name shall be Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and the Prince of Peace. Well, the actual prophecy from verse 2 there is what is actually beginning that overall prophecy from Isaiah, and those famous words that are most associated with Christmas. And they begin by saying what now here Matthew is himself referencing, particularly in verse 16, when he says that the people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light, and for those dwelling in the region or the land of the shadow of death, to them a great light has dawned. Now, of course, considering the fact that Isaiah himself was one of the 8th century prophets, this is roughly 750 years before the words that are being written or spoken of here. And so there's looking forward to, as was so often the case throughout the Old Testament, to this Messiah, this one who would come and save his people, as is the very definition of the name Jesus. But these words that are being spoken here, these words that are being referenced here by Matthew in his authorship are pointing to something very deep, very ethereal, very profound, something very ancient. Indeed, you may recall that we've actually looked at the concept of light not all that long ago. I think it was around January or February of this year, back way beyond the time before COVID. We looked at a passage particularly from 2 Corinthians, wherein the author there, Paul, says that the God who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," has shone the lights of the knowledge of the glory of God in our hearts in the face of Christ Jesus. And we explored that particularly in a 3-week series, if you may recall, where we looked at the concept of light and knowledge and glory and how they were held as the highest ideals or values in the Hebrew, the Greek, and the Roman cultures respectively. Light to the Hebrews, knowledge to the Greeks, and glory to the Romans. We saw how all that was embodied, therefore, in Paul's words, in the very personhood of Jesus. The quintessential ideals now being represented in bodily form, and as well as through his works and actions on earth. But indeed, this concept of light shining out of darkness is something very deep and profound. And so when Isaiah is talking 750 years, 3/4 of a millennium before the coming of this Messianic figure, I wonder how many people in that sort of interlude period there were looking at these words and wondering when. When would this light come? When would this light dawn upon the people? Of course, as is so familiar to us, throughout the Old Testament there were no shortages of periods that could be aptly described as darkness. The book of Judges contains what is, at least by all accounts, some horrific details of darkness and lawlessness and borderline anarchy in certain scenarios, of deep evil, deep evil. Indeed, we see so often throughout the major and minor prophets of the writings that there was bad king after bad king and horrific allowance of pagan idolatry in the temple and prostitution and murder and slander and all manner of evil and darkness. And that was within the people of God. These were not events being described that were happening per se in Moab or Edom or Assyria. Most of what we see is being described in Jerusalem or in the southern kingdom of Judea, let alone the 10 tribes up in the north, which eventually would be wiped off the face of the earth by the Assyrians. There's great darkness that's been portrayed and communicated to us in the Old Testament as a matter of history. And we of course see so much light coming forward in those scenarios. We see the scarlet thread, as it's referred to in theological terms, the movement of God and the way in which his people truly did remain faithful, and they were saved just the way that we are, by grace alone and through faith alone. Even during Isaiah's time, looking forward, and we see, of course, even those reminiscent of Jeremiah's day in the lead up to the onslaught of the Babylonians, and the great weeping that there was in the city. We see men like Jeremiah, who was a very lonely man. I mean, he's referred to as the weeping prophet, and that's for a reason. Because by all accounts, Jeremiah was, certain in his primacy of when he was writing, more or less the only person in Jerusalem who was truly kind of in tune with what God was doing. And really the only person remaining faithful. And this was a man witnessing the destruction of Zion, the city of God. This fast forwards even to, of course, Jesus' day. But we see here that Matthew is repeating this prophecy from Isaiah. That to the people who were once dwelling in darkness, a great light has come to them. Those who dwelt, who lived, who were immersed, who were in captivity in the land of the shadow of death. For them a great light has now dawned. Even the imagery of the actual specific words that have been chosen here are really quite powerful. First, of course, is this reference to the land of the shadow of death. For most of you, that will remind you perhaps of Psalm 23. That yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. It's the exact same reference. Here it's kind of just got a Greek bent on it, skia thanatos. And to really deepen and dark kind of imagery that's being conjured here in the Greek. Thanatos, the word, was not just a word describing something. Thanatos was the actual personification of death in the Greco-Roman culture, particularly in Greek religion. The very embodiment of death, and therefore deep darkness. There's something very dark associated with the employment of that language. Those who dwell in that land of darkness, to them, a great light has dawned. Literally, the sun has risen upon them. Which, of course, is in itself an interesting pun. You could kind of put a Christian bent on it, that the sun has risen. But nevertheless, it's actually literally talking about the sun rising at the dawn. Something new has come, something has dawned upon them. Darkness is now being driven back because light has now appeared. This, of course, is specifically referencing the person of Jesus. And this is where we get into the meat of substance, especially when you consider this passage, but then more broadly, think about its implications through that same post-Tenebras Lux, after darkness, light. You see, the solas of the Reformation that we've looked at many times before were not explicitly written down by, say, Luther or Zwingli or Calvin or any of the other reformers in a really concise, one-page codified manner. They were first, as far as my memory recalls, kind of codified or coined by the Dutch Reformed Church, right, who were one of the first major strongholds of the Reformation era. But nevertheless, these were certainly doctrinal points which were discussed heavily by the reformers who wrote the most material. But the one thing which was unifying about all of them was this saying: post-Tenebras Lux, after darkness, light. And indeed, if anything had become the anthem, the battle cry, the motto of the Reformation, it was this. There are many universities that bear this saying. There are a number of cities, including the very city of Geneva in Switzerland itself, which was, of course, one of the first, other than in the Netherlands, the first major reformed province or city. Calvin did a lot of work in Geneva, and for the majority of the last 500 years, an expanded statement of this baseline post-Tenebras Lux was the very motto of Geneva. In fact, even in Geneva itself, specifically at the University of Geneva, which John Calvin himself founded, you find a monument known as the Reformation Wall, or the Monument to the Reformation. It features statues of Calvin and Knox and a handful of others. Theodore Beza, who was kind of the successor to John Calvin. And behind them reads this inscription, post-Tenebras Lux. So clearly this held great weight to the Reformers and the first Protestants, right? This was something that unified them. This was something which called them together and reminded them of something quite deep and profound to them. That after darkness, there is light. And indeed, it is exactly reminiscent of what is being described here by Matthew, that there has been great darkness upon the earth, and the people have dwelt in the valley of the deepest darkness, of the shadow of death. But now unto them a great light has dawned. Namely, the God-man, God come to earth in human flesh, Jesus Christ. So often with theology we can talk about so many other peripheral sort of lines of inquiry, many other theological points that come sort of out as an extension of the gospel. But one thing which Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, and the whole lot of them always would continually remind people of, either in their preaching or in their writing, was that this movement of God on the earth in that time was ultimately about one thing: the centrality of Jesus and his sacrifice. It started small, it started sort of unaware. Certainly Luther, in the literal day of 31st of October 1517, when he did famously post his 95 theses, his 95 complaints on the church door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, Germany. His intentions were not to change the face of Europe or the world. In fact, he was seeking rather genuine, fairly innocuous academic discussion and dialogue. And that quickly evolved, and Luther obviously picked up onto that, and as did those around him and those who would come in the successive generations afterward. But nevertheless, the overall movement of the Reformation was about the rediscovery of this light, about light once again actually shining out into the darkness and driving it back. This was not necessarily a darkness of academic knowledge, as is often the Enlightenment claim. Many of you will have heard the term the Dark Ages being used to describe that roughly 1,000-year period between 500 and 1500. Obviously, that is a somewhat pejorative term that's used mainly by 17th and 18th century French and German philosophers to say, oh, they were just dumb Christians back then, now we've discovered the truth. Rather pejorative and inaccurate, because there was much knowledge and there was great academic and scientific advancement. But if to ever apply the term Dark Ages to anything during the Middle Ages, you would say that it was the Dark Ages in terms of the gospel itself, and the light of the gospel and the light of the one who is the very embodiment of that gospel. It was indeed a dark age, because for the better part of 1,000 years, institutional systems across the European continent had ruled with iron fist. Anybody born into that society, no matter whether it was in the Kingdom of France, the Kingdom of Spain, or any of the various duchies of Germany, the Papal States itself, the Holy Roman Empire, you were engrossed, of course, in this system. There was no differentiation between the state and the church, for example. Your baptism, your christening was your birth certificate. It was the way in which you were identified. If people wanted to know who you were, they would go through a registry that was kept in your given place of birth and find when you were actually baptized. That was your birth certificate. The tradition and the hierarchy and the power of Rome immersed everyone across the European continent, and there was no escaping from that. Therefore, there was no escaping from the tight grasp of that power. What the hierarchy and the tradition had determined was true is what was true, and there would be no speaking against it. We saw how Martin Luther, with very good intention and with fairly innocuous intention, unassuming intention, sought out what he imagined would be genuine academic discussion. Not a confrontation, not a flamboyant and hostile argument, a genuine academic discussion. And it led to, years later, this process developing whereby he was brought before some of the most powerful people on the face of the earth, and he did actually argue with the most powerful man in Charles V, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, for daring the question and for daring to suggest that, amongst many other things, the process of indulgement, the way that communion was done, although his position on communion certainly lies between Catholicism and what we would hold as well, but nevertheless, many of the practices of the church in that day, his even voicing of an opinion contrary to that would lead to incredible strife. We see men like William Tyndale, the Englishman, an incredibly brilliant man, virtual genius, an incredible academic, multitude of languages, spoken and wrote fluently in at least 8, maybe 13. And when he saw what was going on, the differences between the priesthood, this upper echelon class, and the average peasantry in England, the fact that in any given town, say it was here in Katoomba, there would be one of these, and it would be under lock and key in the building halfway up the street. And the priest would open it, and he would tell you what it means, because only he is smart enough, holy enough, righteous enough to read and understand what's going on. Well, here comes William Tyndale and saying that, well, no, the people should have this. The people should have knowledge of what is in the Gospels and more broadly in the Scriptures at large, and they should have it in a language they can understand, not Latin. Put it in English. Even that itself led to a confrontation with a fairly high-ranking priest, or a fairly well-known priest in the City of London, whereby he said that I will cause the plough worker, the farmer in the field, to know more than the Pope in Rome. Of course, as some of you familiar, this led him on a roughly 10-year journey where he fled, exiled into Europe, into secrecy, supported by those around him, so that he could translate the Scriptures from the original manuscripts into English. Indeed, William Tyndale was the most wanted man in Europe for pretty much the majority of the 1530s. He was, of course, eventually captured by a very vast and expansive spy network established by the Empire, and was brought back to England and was burnt at the stake. This is what was being dealt with. This level of darkness. And a particular darkness, by the way, that was not so obvious. We see even in our own time, things go on and we so obviously identify with darkness. We see horrifically brutal regimes like that in Iran or in China or elsewhere. And we so obviously identify that as unchristian, as ungodly, as pagan. Here, for the better part of 1,000 years in the European continent, we had a system which would almost seem ridiculous to criticise as somehow not Christian. How could you say we're not Christians? Look at our church, look at the Bible, look at all the priesthood, look at the sacraments. It had every appearance of being oh so Christian, but in fact being quite arguably one of the greatest devices that the devil had ever employed. Having the appearance thereof but not the substance. Almost reminiscent of being like whitewashed tombs but filled with dead men's bones. But here, through the action of God, via many men and women in that day, in the 1500s, beginning and then moving forward, light was once again dawning upon the darkness and those who dwelt within. Light was now coming, just as had come from that point backward 1,500 years before, in the person of Jesus Christ. And here, as the gospel itself was rediscovered, as the truth of the fact that salvation is not brought about by a meticulous keeping of sacraments, which there were far more than two, of regular attendance at Mass, regular confession, regular penitence, and an engrossment in a system that required virtually mental enslavement. Here, by Luther and others, the gospel of the truth was being discovered. Namely, that we are actually in fact saved by grace and by faith alone, in Jesus alone, according to the Scriptures alone, unto the glory of God alone. The hope that was now coming, joy, warmth, gladness, a future to look forward to, and an eternal hope to hold dear in one's heart. That's what was now dawning once more into the darkness that existed. It was not a despair that had existed for 1,000 years. This was no more exemplified, certainly in Luther's mind, than when he had taken a trip to Rome not long before he posted his his 95 points upon the church door in 1517. He was in Rome on more official business as a university lecturer, and of course during this time St. Peter's Basilica, the giant basilica that is now in Rome today, was being built at this time. And mass donations were of course being raised to that, and they used donations in a very generous way. And he saw in Rome at what was the existing basilica or cathedral thousands, tens of thousands of people engaging in an act of penitence which was supposed to guarantee them respectively different amounts of time off from their time in purgatory, a reduction in sentence, so to speak. And the penitence, of course, was to climb up each individual step, saying 10 Hail Marys and repeating Lord's prayers over and over, and doing that at every single step on one's hands and knees. Well, this basilica had over 100 stairs. And this kind of broke Luther when as he was heading up into the basilica, when he saw somewhere up the top in about the last quarter or the last sixth of the staircase, a very elderly woman, bleeding profusely from the knees, crying more from the pain than anything else. This is what was churning in the minds of those men and women during that time. It was things like that, or things like back in Germany when he had gone home to Wittenberg and coming across sort of ambassadors, so to speak, of the church, like Tetzel, who was going around offering a special indulgence. An indulgence is a system in brevity, I'm oversimplifying this, whereby you contribute a sort of penitent donation and you would receive consequent deduction in time as a sign of your holiness from purgatory, or for those in this special case, for those who were already in purgatory, family members, for grandma or mum or dad or brother or children, which was what made it so rare in that time. And Luther was witnessing the single mothers whose husband had died, whose 3/4 of their children had died, offering up their last piece of coin in a hope that they would perhaps get some time off for their 2-year-old that died of tuberculosis. This was the darkness. But here the gospel was once again coming forward in light. Might we think perhaps how this applies to us today, or might we think about how this legacy of history in time and space impacts us in 2020, more than 500 years later? Well, of course, it's not too difficult to find a plethora of abiding darkness in our own world. It's not all that difficult to find darkness even in our own society. Half the time we have problems with dealing with perhaps other churches that we don't believe are helping in a theological sense, or perhaps we're dealing with broader societal issues. We see society slipping away further into just postmodern insanity, into a complete abandonment of truth and morality and justice. We turn on our television and we can see 100 and something dead in Afghanistan, and another 50 dead in Mali, and 47 dead in Belize, and so on and so forth. We see death and calamity and darkness, all from our devices. Even myself, I find myself sometimes, not so much with what's going on in other places around the world, because I kind of just expect that, but thinking about things, say, in Australia or in the United States or other places in the West perhaps. And even myself, I find myself get frustrated at times about the darkness that I see. And going, and just this sense of almost anger at it. And as things continue to decline, and as we or your children or your children's children deal with the fallout of darkness enveloping our own society, it's important to remember that post Tenebras Lux, that after darkness comes light. And that our hope is not in political institutions, it's not in social institutions. There is no politician which will save us. There is no church leader which will carry us to the promised land. Our one and only hope has to be the very same one and only hope that the Reformers held. The person of Jesus Christ. The fact that he made an eternal sacrifice that is now rendered unto our account by grace alone, through faith alone. It's the only hope we have. It's the only hope. When we see darkness around the world, when we see darkness continuing to expand and envelop our own society, even in more personal or momentary circumstances perhaps, when you feel overwhelmed by darkness, the one hope that you can reliably and continually cling to is that God is good, is that God holds you firmly in his hand. That perhaps your salvation is not up to you, it's not up to your penitent work or your partaking in the sacraments or your attendance at Mass/the church, but rather it is in a sacrifice that's already been made on your behalf. And that it is indeed God who has saved you, not you who have so humbly saved yourself unto God. And if God is the one who has saved you by grace alone, through faith alone, then it is he alone who holds you in his hand. And if he has already promised that all his people will come to him, that those who come to me I will never cast away, that they'll never slip through my hands. If he's already promised that, then that is the hope. Things in our own world will reach a state of darkness beyond what any single one of us in this room can even begin to imagine. We can try and picture the worst things, and we will be about 5% of the way. The level of darkness that will take this place over will astound us. And what people will have to deal with during that spiraling devolution, we will have to remain faithful and hopeful in the light. Indeed, a perfect piece of imagery, which is encapsulated not just in this text, but indeed actually in nature, is that nighttime in nature progresses in the amount of darkness, or rather in the lack of light. And the nighttime gets progressively darker and darker and darker, all the way up until about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, when it's at its darkest, when there is the least amount of light. But then, of course, every single morning, as has happened for all of our own lives, and will continue to happen, dawn comes. The sun rises. It's something that happens every single day and has always happened every single day. But the night is at its darkest right before the dawn. I think that's a fascinating piece of imagery to describe what was going on in the 1st century, to describe subsequently what was going on in the 16th century, and to describe what we or those who come after us will have to deal with in this world and at the end of this world. That the night will be at its darkest right before the dawn, but indeed the dawn will come and the light will shine again. That will of course be that second coming of Christ for us. It will be the light of the world once again actually physically coming into the world. I mean, we hold the same eternal hope that the first disciples held. I mean, we hold the same eternal hope that the Reformers themselves held. When things seem dark in our personal lives or when we witness darkness around us, may we remember the same post-Tenebras Lux, after darkness,
light.